all over the place. So, what's the first premise? This part at least is easy, right? Yeah.
We find in nature that things are possible to be and not to be.
Okay, good. So, we find in nature things that are possible to be and not to be. To summarize that, let's just call them possible beings. So a possible being that we're defining as a being whose existence is not necessary. It is possible for it to exist or not to exist. That then will be contrasted with a necessary being, which is that a being that cannot not exist. So whose existence is necessary, right? So how does he describe then these possible beings? Well, he says, since they are found to be generated and to corrupt, and consequently they are possible to be and not to be. So generated and to corrupt, what does that mean?
Create.
Well, to die, so the corrupted part, and what?
And then to create, like.
Okay, so, well, not quite to create, but to be created. Okay. So they are found to be generated, that is to be created, and to corrupt. Right? So they can die and pass away. And consequently, they're possible to be and not to be. All right. Next premise.
I don't know. That which does not exist only begins to exist by something already existing.
Okay. I think we're skipping a bunch there.
No.
That's an important part of it. Well, what's the next point that he makes?
It is impossible for these always to exist.
Okay. So it is impossible for possible beings always to exist. For that which is possible not to be, at some point, is not. Okay, next. Now notice we have our first sub-conclusion here. It says, therefore, this is going to be a little different argument structure from what we've seen before. So therefore, if everything is possible not to be, then at one time there could have been nothing in existence. So again, paraphrasing, if everything were a possible being, then at one time there would have been nothing in existence. Okay, yeah.
Shouldn't it be could have been? Because that kind of changes things a lot. It says could have been.
Okay. I don't think it changes what he's getting at. You're right, he does say could have been. But he doesn't think that could have been, that there's nothing in existence, as we'll see. So again, I don't think it changes the meaning of it. Okay, now, what does he say? Now, if this were true, that there would have been nothing in existence, or could have been nothing in existence, it would have been impossible for anything to have begun to exist. And thus, even now, nothing would be in existence, which is absurd. Therefore, not all beings are merely possible, but there must exist something, the existence of which is necessary. So, how are we going to tear all that apart and represent it. Yeah.
Well, he says that conclusion is false,
Mhm.
so the opposite must be true, not everything is possible, something must
Okay.
be necessary.
Okay, so it can't be the case that everything is a possible being, because
Nothing would exist.
nothing would exist now if there was a time in which nothing exists, right? So let's try this. If there were a time when nothing had existed, then would exist now. Good. But of course he says that's absurd. Why?
Because we're existing.
Yeah, things exist now.
Or there must be, there could be a necessary need, I don't know.
Not merely could be,
So,
must be.
yes.
Now this is interesting. Let's focus on these three. Okay? Let's apply something that we've learned, something very important that we learned earlier in the semester, and apply it to these. It's a logical form that I taught you. Yes?
Therefore, not all beings are possible.
Okay, that is going to be the conclusion that follows from this by the application of what argument form? I gave you a particular name of an argument form. Modus tollens, okay. I told you we'd be running into this during the semester. And what is modus tollens? What's the argument form? The one thing I want you to remember from this semester,
Nothing of the mind.
Not even.
the P and Q. It's not an if, just second premise is,
Not P, not Q.
by the way,
You,
not Q,
Not Q,
therefore not P. Okay, how does that apply to these? Things exist now. What's that the denial of?
that goes into,
Plus three.
wait,
What part of premise 3? Things exist now is the denial of nothing would exist now. Okay? And so if we combine premise 3 and premise 4, by modus tollens, what follows?
There wouldn't be a time when nothing existed.
What's that?
There wouldn't be a time when nothing.
Yeah, there wouldn't be a time at which nothing existed. And so if there wouldn't have been a time nothing existed, then we can combine that with this by modus tollens to get,
That everything is not.
yeah, it's not the case that everything were a possible being. So combining these, right, we get two applications of modus tollens to get the conclusion that he has, right? Not all beings are merely possible, but there must exist something, the existence of which is necessary, which is a really wordy way of saying there must be a necessary being. You want to see this more explicitly, how we apply the modus tollens here? Was that, yeah, okay. So, let's look at premise 3 and premise 4. Let's write them over here. This is a great logic exercise. Okay? So, if there were a time at which nothing existed, that existed, and nothing would exist now. But, let's just call that P1. P2, things exist now. So, if we bracket and label the, what are the parts of the hypothetical proposition here? The, yeah, what are they called, the parts? Of the whole if then, the first part is called the antecedent, good, and this is called the consequence. So if P then Q, things do exist now, this is not Q. So if nothing would exist now, all right, that's Q, then this must be not Q. So by modus tollens, there's not a time at which nothing had existed. That's our not P. And Aquinas is counting on you to be able to see that that's what follows from this stuff, right? Question? Okay, so we get this implicit conclusion following from these. So then we can apply this to that first sub-conclusion, right? So if everything were a possible being, then at one time there would have been nothing in existence, but following from P3 and P4, there's not a time at which nothing had existed. Once again, we can label this. So, if everything were a possible being, if P, then at one time there would have been nothing in existence, Q. There is not a time at which nothing had existed, right? Because nothing is in existence. That is not Q again. Therefore, not everything is a possible being, not P. Which, in fact, happens to be the conclusion that he draws. Therefore, not all beings are merely possible, but there must exist something, the existence of which is necessary. In other words, there exists a necessary being, and we don't have to worry about the next couple sentences. That's all kind of unnecessary and uninteresting. Right? So there must be then a being that is necessary, whose necessity comes from itself, and of course, everybody calls such a being God. So we already know the steps through here must be valid, right? Applications of modus tollens is valid. What about the rest of it? I mean, what do you think of this argument? This is a pretty strong argument, right? I mean, it's not merely that God existed at one point. It's, no, there must be a necessary being, a God that exists at all times. Yeah.
I don't know if I necessarily agree with premise 2. It isn't possible for possible beings to always exist. He kind of just makes that assumption.
Okay.
Doesn't that
Mhm.
make sense because his definition of a possible being is that they are created and then they die?
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Two very important points. His understanding of a possible being is one that is generated and corrupted, right? But you're thinking, well, wait a minute. Why do we have to understand a possible being in that way? And this is a very interesting question. The way that he seems to be understanding what a possible being is and what a necessary being is, right? It seems to be like a temporal understanding of it. So possible beings cannot exist eternally. Necessary beings exist eternally. But we might question that, right? I mean, that seems to be what you're questioning, right? Okay. Well, how might we understand possible and necessary if not in those terms? Any thoughts on the matter? I mean, you've raised an excellent question. Let's try to answer it. Let's try to come up with an alternate conception of possibility and necessity. Let's think of it this way. Suppose that we have an atom. And this atom has existed from the beginning of time. And let's suppose that this atom will never cease existing. Do we therefore conclude that this atom is a necessary being? Is this atom God? Has God been reduced to an atom? I'm saying atom, not Adam. Sorry.
Destroy a city.
What's that?
You can destroy a city.
He very well could be if that's the only thing that was in existence.
But here's the question. No, I'm not saying it's the only thing in existence.
Oh.
I'm just saying, let's hypothesize we have this atom. And it has always existed, right, eternally into the past. And will exist eternally into the future. Is that enough to think that this atom is a necessary being?
It doesn't really conclude that it's necessary in any way because it could go its entire existence not having any effect on anything anywhere.
Okay. Let's suppose that it does. I mean, I don't know if that has any bearing on the question. Let's suppose that it does have some effect on things. So it used to be part of George Washington's body. In the future, it's part of the singularity. The singularity is coming, people. Google Glasses, that's the first step. We're all going to be part of the collective in 20 years.
Is the only requirement for necessary being to be eternal?
That's what we're wondering. Can we think of a different understanding of necessity
Than just being eternal?
from just being eternal, right? Because being eternal, that doesn't seem to be very impressive, right? I mean, think about this atom. It has existed eternally, will exist eternally. Yeah.
And I think a better way of saying necessity is something that had to have created our existence, not just necessarily lives eternally.
Okay. Maybe. Maybe that has something to do with it, right? Creating everything else. I mean, Aquinas would certainly think that. That's part of the conception of God that he has. So God created everything else. But what else? Think of it this way. Can you think of this atom not existing? Sure. So yeah, the atom has always existed, will always exist, but I can imagine the world existing without the atom, right? So there's a different way that philosophers like to think of possibility and necessity nowadays. Philosophers love to talk about so-called possible worlds. What? And philosophers also